Sometime in the middle of May 1942, a strange message crackled across the airwaves from a tiny speck of sand and coral in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The garrison on Midway Atoll was reporting an emergency. Their water distillation plant had broken down. They had only enough fresh water to last 2 weeks. They desperately needed resupply. It was a lie. Every single word of it. The distillation plant was working perfectly. The water supply was fine. But halfway around the world in Tokyo, Japanese naval intelligence officers intercepted that message, believed it completely, and sent a coded report to their fleet commanders. That coded report said something very specific. It said that AF, their secret designation for an upcoming invasion target, was running low on water. The Americans intercepted that Japanese message. They decoded it, and in that moment they knew exactly where Japan was about to strike with the largest naval force ever assembled in the Pacific. They knew because they had tricked the Japanese into confirming it themselves. This is the story of how a fake water shortage helped America sink 4 aircraft carriers at the Battle of Midway. It is a story of brilliant codebreakers working in a sweltering basement, of bitter rivalries between Washington and Pearl Harbor, of admirals gambling everything on a single throw of the dice, and of one simple but ingenious deception that changed the course of World War II. The men who pulled off this intelligence coup worked in a place they called the dungeon. It was a windowless basement beneath the administration building at Pearl Harbor, accessible only through a heavy steel vault door guarded by armed Marines. The air inside was thick with cigarette smoke and the constant hum of tabulating machines that ran 24 hours a day. There were no windows because windows would have been a security risk. There was barely any ventilation because ventilation ducts could carry sound to unauthorized ears. The temperature regularly climbed above 90 degrees Fahrenheit in the Hawaiian heat. The smell of sweat, stale coffee, and overworked machinery hung in the air at all hours. This was Station Hypo, the combat intelligence unit of the 14th Naval District. The name came from the phonetic alphabet designation for the letter H, meaning Hawaii. It was one of 3 American signals intelligence stations focused on the Pacific alongside Station Cast, which had evacuated from the Philippines to Melbourne, and Station Negat in Washington. But it was Hypo working in that dank basement that would provide the intelligence that saved the Pacific Fleet. The man in charge was Commander Joseph John Rockefort. He was 42 years old in 1942, a lanky Californian with a sharp mind and an unconventional style that drove his superiors in Washington to distraction. He often worked in a bathrobe and slippers, pacing between desks while chewing on an unlit pipe. He had a cot in the office because he rarely left. Days would pass without him seeing sunlight. He had spent 3 years in Japan starting in 1929, learning the language and the culture. Living among the Japanese people, he understood the Japanese military mind in ways that few American officers could match. Rockefort led a team of about 40 cryptanalysts, linguists, and traffic analysts. Their mission was to break the Imperial Japanese Navy's primary operational code, a system the Americans designated JN-25. This was not a simple substitution cipher that could be cracked by a single brilliant insight. It was a super-enciphered code of formidable complexity designed by some of the best cryptographic minds in Japan. The system used 2 separate books that worked together. The first book was a massive codebook containing approximately 30,000 5-digit number groups, each divisible by 3, each representing a specific word, phrase, or concept. The second book contained additive tables, essentially random number sequences used to further scramble those code groups before transmission. To send a message, a Japanese radio operator would first look up each word in the codebook, then add a random number from the additive table to further disguise the underlying group. To read a single message, Rockefort's codebreakers had to reverse this entire process. First, they had to strip away the additive through painstaking mathematical analysis, comparing thousands of messages to find patterns in the random numbers. Then they had to decode the underlying groups, many of which they had never seen before, and whose meanings had to be deduced from context. It was intellectual work of the highest order, requiring both mathematical brilliance and intuitive leaps. Progress came agonizingly slowly, one fragment at a time. Before Pearl Harbor, the Americans could read perhaps 10 to 15% of intercepted messages. By April 1942, 5 months later, Rockefeller's team could understand approximately one word in 5. That does not sound like much, but it was enough to see the outlines of what Japan was planning. The codebreakers worked in shifts around the clock, never stopping. They processed hundreds of intercepted messages each day. Most messages yielded only fragments, isolated words or phrases that made no sense on their own. But over time, patterns emerged. Ship designators appeared repeatedly. Geographic code names recurred. Dates and times could be extracted. Slowly, the mosaic took shape. Among Rockefeller's key people was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, a mathematical genius who led the analytical attack on the code structure. Dyer could look at columns of seemingly random numbers and spot the patterns that revealed the underlying additive system. There was Lieutenant Commander Joseph Finnegan, a brilliant linguist described by colleagues as intuitive and creative, who discovered how the Japanese encoded their date and time groups, a breakthrough that allowed the Americans to predict when operations would occur. There was Lieutenant Commander Wilfred Holmes, a recalled reservist and former engineering professor at the University of Hawaii, who tracked Japanese ship movements using all available sources of intelligence. And there was Captain Alva Laswell, a quiet perfectionist who headed the translation section, converting the recovered code groups into readable English. Rockefeller recruited from unusual sources. He brought in musicians from the band of the sunken battleship California, reasoning that their pattern recognition skills and ability to detect subtle variations would transfer well to code breaking. He was right. These former bandsmen became skilled traffic analysts, tracking the movement and activity of Japanese radio stations across the Pacific. By the spring of 1942, the fragments these men pulled from coded messages had begun to form a disturbing picture. The Japanese Navy was preparing something massive. A major offensive was in the works. Intercepted messages referenced a target location designated only by 2 letters, AF. Ships were being assigned to task forces. Aircraft were being moved. Supplies were being stockpiled. Whatever was coming would be big. The question was simple but crucial. What did AF mean? Where exactly were the Japanese planning to strike with this enormous force? To understand why this question mattered so desperately, you have to understand what had happened in the Pacific in the 6 months since December 7, 1941. Japan had achieved a string of stunning victories that seemed to defy all pre-war expectations. Pearl Harbor had crippled the American battleship fleet, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and killing over 2,400 Americans. The Philippines had fallen after a desperate defense, with thousands of American and Filipino soldiers marching into brutal captivity on the Bataan Death March. Singapore, the great British fortress that was supposed to be impregnable, had surrendered with 80,000 troops. The Dutch East Indies with their vital oil fields were in Japanese hands. Hong Kong had fallen on Christmas Day. Wake Island, Guam, Burma, Malaya, all had collapsed before the Japanese onslaught. By May 1942, Japan controlled a vast empire stretching from the borders of India to the islands of the Central Pacific. From the frozen Aleutians to the tropical waters of the Solomon Islands, their forces seemed invincible. The Imperial Japanese Navy had not lost a major battle. Its aviators were the best trained and most experienced in the world. Its ships were faster and more modern than most of their opponents. American morale was at its lowest point of the war. Every week brought news of another defeat, another retreat, another disaster. The only bright spot had been the Doolittle raid on April 18, 1942, when 16 Army B-25 bombers launched from the aircraft carrier Hornet and struck Tokyo itself. The physical damage was minimal, but the psychological impact on Japan's leadership was enormous. The emperor himself had nearly been endangered. The home islands had been violated. Japan's military leaders, who had promised that the homeland would never be attacked, were humiliated. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of Japan's combined fleet, was determined to eliminate any possibility of future raids. He was also determined to finish what Pearl Harbor had started. The American aircraft carriers had been at sea on December 7th and had escaped the attack. Enterprise and Lexington were delivering aircraft to Wake Island. Saratoga was on the west coast. These carriers had become the core of American resistance in the Pacific. As long as they existed, Japan could not secure its conquests. Yamamoto devised a plan to lure the American carriers into a trap and destroy them once and for all. He was a gambler by nature, a man who had spent time in the United States and understood American industrial potential better than most of his colleagues. He knew that Japan had perhaps a year, maybe 18 months before American production would overwhelm Japan's smaller economy. He had to win quickly and decisively or Japan would eventually lose. The plan was called Operation MI. It had multiple objectives that interlocked like the pieces of a puzzle. First, capture Midway Atoll, a tiny but strategically vital American outpost about 1,300 miles northwest of Hawaii. The atoll consisted of two small islands, Sand Island and Eastern Island, with a combined land area of barely 2 square miles. But it had an airfield, and it was close enough to Hawaii that aircraft based there could threaten Pearl Harbor itself. Capturing Midway would extend Japan's defensive perimeter and provide a base for future operations. Second, and more importantly, draw out the American carriers. Yamamoto correctly anticipated that the Americans would rush their remaining flat tops to defend Midway. When they did, his overwhelming force would be waiting to annihilate them. With the American carriers gone, Japan would have complete control of the Pacific. The force Yamamoto assembled was the largest Japan had ever sent to sea. He committed nearly 200 ships to the operation, including 11 battleships, 8 aircraft carriers, 22 cruisers, 65 destroyers, 21 submarines, and hundreds of support vessels. At the heart of this armada was Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo's striking force, the Kido Butai, the mobile force. This was the same carrier force that had attacked Pearl Harbor with devastating effect. The Kido Butai included 4 fleet carriers. Akagi, the flagship, was a converted battle cruiser hull of over 36,000 tons. Kaga was even larger, a converted battleship hull that could carry more aircraft than any other Japanese carrier. Soryu and Hiryu were smaller but fast and deadly, purpose-built carriers of 17,000 tons each. Together, these 4 ships carried approximately 248 operational aircraft, including the famous Zero fighter, the Val dive bomber, and the Kate torpedo bomber. Protecting the carriers were 2 fast battleships, Haruna and Kirishima, veterans of Pearl Harbor, 2 heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, and 12 destroyers screened the formation. It was a powerful force, the most experienced carrier group in the world. Yamamoto himself would command from the massive battleship Yamato, the largest and most powerful warship ever built at that time. At 68,000 tons, she was almost twice the size of an American battleship. Her main battery of 9 18-inch guns could hurl shells weighing nearly 3,000 pounds more than 25 miles. She was the pride of the Japanese Navy, the most powerful surface combatant on any ocean. But Yamamoto positioned himself approximately 600 miles behind Nagumo's carriers, far too distant to provide direct support in a fast-developing carrier battle. This dispersal of forces would prove to be a fatal flaw in the Japanese plan. A separate invasion force under Vice Admiral Nobute Kondo included 12 transports carrying roughly 5,000 troops to occupy Midway once it was secured. Another force under Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya would attack the Aleutian Islands in Alaska, striking Dutch Harbor and occupying the islands of Attu and Kiska. This northern operation was not simply a diversion, as some historians once claimed, but a genuine parallel effort to secure Japan's northern flank and establish bases for potential future operations. Still, it pulled valuable forces away from the main effort at Midway. 2 fleet carriers were notably absent from Nagumo's force. Shokaku had been badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea in early May, her flight deck wrecked by American bombs. She needed months of repair at Kure. Her sister Zuikaku was undamaged but had lost a significant portion of her experienced air crew. The Japanese made no serious effort to provide replacement aircraft or combine surviving air crews from different carriers, a reflection of their rigid organizational practices. This reluctance combined with overconfidence about not needing the extra carriers meant both ships stayed home. The absence of these 2 carriers reduced the Kido Butai from the 6 fleet carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor to just 4. Japanese intelligence made catastrophic errors that would doom the entire operation. They did not know the Americans had broken JN-25 and were reading their operational messages. They believed the carrier Yorktown had been sunk at the Coral Sea when in fact she was damaged but very much afloat. They thought Enterprise and Hornet were still somewhere in the South Pacific when in fact they were racing toward Midway. A planned flying boat reconnaissance of Pearl Harbor was cancelled when American ships were found occupying the refueling point at French frigate shoals. A submarine picket line intended to detect American fleet movements arrived too late after the American carriers had already passed through. War games conducted aboard Yamato before the operation had been manipulated. When umpires allowed Midway's defenders to sink Japanese carriers during the exercises, the results were overruled and reversed. The games were rigged to produce the desired outcome. No one wanted to tell Yamamoto that his plan had weaknesses. While the Japanese prepared their armada, Rochefort's team in the dungeon was piecing together the enemy's intentions. By mid-May, they had identified the essential outlines of the Japanese plan. They knew a major operation was coming. They had identified the approximate date as early June. They knew the strike force would approach from the northwest. They had identified 4 carriers and their supporting ships. They knew about the complementary operation against the Aleutians, and they were convinced based on months of accumulated evidence that AF meant Midway. The problem was that not everyone believed them. In Washington, the Navy's Central Signals Intelligence Command was called OP-20G, part of the Office of Naval Communications. It was led by Commander John Redmond, a communications specialist who had been installed just a few months earlier. Redmond had no experience in cryptanalysis. He had never broken a code in his life, but he had bureaucratic power and a powerful ally. His older brother, Captain Joseph Redman, was Director of Naval Communications and wielded enormous influence over Navy intelligence operations. Together, the Redman brothers viewed Rochefort as a rival, an upstart, and a threat to their authority. OP-20G rejected Station Hypo's conclusion that AF meant Midway. They produced alternative analyses claiming the target could be almost anywhere. The South Pacific, Samoa, the Aleutians, the American West Coast, even Hawaii itself. Some in Washington argued for defending multiple locations simultaneously, which would have dispersed American forces exactly as the Japanese hoped. The institutional rivalry was bitter and personal. The Redman brothers resented that Rochefort reported his findings directly to Admiral Nimitz's intelligence officer, Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, rather than routing everything through Washington. This violated the bureaucratic chain of command. It made the Washington office look irrelevant. Layton and Rochefort had been friends since their days studying Japanese together in Tokyo. They had first met aboard the SS President Adams, sailing to Japan in the summer of 1929. They lived in the same apartment building, the Bunker Apartments, described as the only modern apartment complex in Tokyo at the time. The Rocheforts occupied a twin-bedded room with a kitchen. Layton, a bachelor, took a single room down the corridor. They studied the language together through 1932, and during summers at the mountain retreat of Koizawa, the Rocheforts treated Layton as a member of the family. They trusted each other implicitly, a trust forged over years of friendship. When Rochefort told Layton that AF was Midway, Layton believed him. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet and the most powerful naval officer in Washington, sided with OP-20G. King was a difficult man, brilliant but abrasive. He did not know Rochefort personally but did trust his Washington staff. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet from Pearl Harbor, trusted his local team. Nimitz was a quieter man than King, thoughtful and deliberate, a leader who listened to his subordinates and weighed evidence carefully. He had seen Rochefort's intelligence proven correct before. The question was how to settle the dispute definitively. Washington demanded proof. The answer came from a conversation at Jasper Holmes's desk in the dungeon. According to Ensign Donald Showers, who was sitting at the adjacent desk and later provided a detailed eyewitness account to the National Security Agency, Rochefort approached Holmes in mid-May and asked if he had any ideas about how to confirm that AF really meant Midway. Finnegan joined the discussion. The 3 men stood there surrounded by stacks of coded messages and tabulating machinery trying to figure out how to trick the Japanese into revealing their own secrets. Holmes thought for a moment. Then he connected 2 facts that he knew better than almost anyone. From his years as a professor at the University of Hawaii, Holmes knew that Midway's garrison depended entirely on a saltwater distillation plant for fresh water. The atoll had no natural springs, no wells, no freshwater source of any kind. If that plant failed, the garrison would be in serious trouble within days. This was a known vulnerability, something anyone familiar with the atoll would understand. Holmes also knew that an undersea telegraph cable connected Oahu to Midway, laid years before as part of the Trans-Pacific Communications Network. This cable provided a communication channel that the Japanese could not intercept or decode. Messages sent by cable were completely secure. Holmes proposed a simple but elegant solution. Send instructions to Midway via the secure undersea cable. Have the garrison commander broadcast an uncoded radio message in plain English reporting that the water distillation plant had broken down. Make it sound urgent. Make it sound real. The Japanese listening posts on nearby Wake Island would certainly intercept this transmission. If AF really meant Midway, Japanese intelligence would include the water shortage in their coded communications to the fleet. Finnegan added a refinement. When the Japanese passed along the water shortage report, they would probably do so using their own code. Station Hypo could then intercept that coded message and see whether it mentioned AF in connection with the water problem. If it did, the identification would be confirmed beyond any doubt. Rochefort's response was immediate and enthusiastic. Very good, Jasper. Very good. Those words would remain indelible in Ensign Showers's memory for the rest of his life. The approval chain moved with remarkable speed. Rochefort endorsed the plan and took it to Layton. Layton presented it to Admiral Nimitz that same day. Nimitz understood the elegance of the scheme immediately. He approved it on the spot and ordered it executed. On May 19, 1942, Midway's radio operators broadcast the fake emergency message in plain unencoded English that anyone could read. They reported that the island's water evaporators had suffered serious damage. They claimed to have only enough fresh water to last 2 weeks. They urgently requested resupply from Pearl Harbor. The message went out in the clear, deliberately unsecured, designed to be intercepted by Japanese listening stations across the Pacific. The trap was set. Now they had to wait. 2 days later, on May 22nd, the answer came. The Fleet Radio Unit in Melbourne, Australia, intercepted and decoded a Japanese message originating from Naval Intelligence Headquarters in Tokyo. The message was addressed to the commanders of the Midway Invasion Force. It reported that the AF Air Unit had sent a radio communication stating they had only enough water for 2 weeks and needed immediate resupply. The confirmation was devastating in its clarity. AF was Midway. There could be no possible doubt the Japanese themselves had confirmed it using their own secret code by repeating back the very lie that the Americans had fed them. Rochefort had deliberately arranged for the confirmation to arrive through Melbourne rather than his own station. This was a subtle but important move. If Station Hypo had provided the confirmation, Washington could have dismissed it as Rochefort finding what he wanted to find. But Melbourne was an independent station with no stake in the dispute. Their confirmation could not be attributed to bias. Armed with this certainty, Admiral Nimitz could now act decisively. He knew exactly where the Japanese would strike and approximately when they would arrive. He had perhaps 2 weeks to prepare an ambush against a force that outnumbered him in almost every category. His 3 available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the badly damaged Yorktown, would face 4 Japanese fleet carriers backed by the most powerful surface fleet in the Pacific. The numerical odds were daunting. The Japanese had 4 fleet carriers to his 3. They had 11 battleships. He had none available for the battle. They had 22 cruisers. He had 8. By any normal calculation, the Americans should lose. But Nimitz had something the Japanese did not. He knew they were coming. He knew where they would be. He knew when they would arrive, and he intended to use that knowledge to spring a trap. One of Nimitz's first decisions seemed almost impossible to execute. The carrier Yorktown had limped back to Pearl Harbor on May 27th, trailing a 10-mile oil slick from damage suffered at the Coral Sea. She had taken a bomb hit that penetrated deep into her hull. Initial estimates from Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch said she needed 90 days in dry dock to be properly repaired. Nimitz went aboard personally to inspect the damage. He walked through the damaged compartments, examined the shored-up bulkheads, and spoke with the engineering officers. Then he told the yard commander that he needed Yorktown back at sea in 3 days. 3 days for repairs that should take 3 months. 1,400 shipyard workers swarmed aboard the carrier. They worked in shifts around the clock, never stopping, sleeping in whatever corners they could find. They patched hull plates with steel cut from other ships. They shored up damaged frames with timber and steel beams. They restored electrical circuits and pumping systems. Welders worked through the night, their torches casting strange shadows in the damaged compartments. Some repairs were left undone. Damaged superheater boilers remained unrepaired because there was no time, but the essential systems were restored. On May 30th, just 72 hours after entering dry dock number 1, Yorktown backed out of the dock and headed for sea. She still had repair crews aboard. She was not fully operational, but she could launch and recover aircraft. She could fight. Task Force 16, built around Enterprise and Hornet under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, had departed Pearl Harbor on May 28th. Spruance was not the original commander. Vice Admiral William Halsey, the aggressive carrier leader who should have commanded, was in the hospital with a severe case of dermatitis that left him unable to function. Halsey personally recommended Spruance as his replacement, a cruiser admiral with no carrier experience but with a brilliant tactical mind. Task Force 17, built around Yorktown under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, sailed on May 30th. Fletcher, as the senior officer, would have overall tactical command of both task forces. The two forces rendezvoused on June 2nd at a point about 325 miles northeast of Midway that the planners had designated Point Luck. Nimitz's written orders to Fletcher embodied the desperate nature of the gamble. Fletcher was to operate under the principle of calculated risk. He was to avoid exposing his force to attack by superior enemy forces without a good prospect of inflicting greater damage on the enemy. In other words, if the trap failed, Fletcher was authorized to withdraw and save his ships. America could not afford to lose its last carriers. But Nimitz had given his commanders something more valuable than ships. He had given them knowledge. Edwin Layton had provided a prediction of extraordinary precision based on Station Hypo's intelligence. The Japanese carriers would appear on a bearing of 325 degrees at 175 nautical miles from Midway at approximately 0600 hours on June 4th. Nimitz later remarked that Layton's prediction was only 5 degrees, 5 miles, and 5 minutes off. The morning of June 4th, 1942 began in the darkness before dawn with Japanese overconfidence and American anticipation. At approximately 0430, Vice Admiral Nagumo launched the first strike against Midway. 108 aircraft roared off the flight decks of the 4 carriers and headed southeast toward the atoll. 36 Val dive bombers, 36 K torpedo bombers, and 36 Zero fighters would hit Midway's defenses and destroy its air capability. But the Americans were ready. A patrol plane from Midway had spotted the Japanese fleet at 0534, almost exactly where Layton had predicted. Thanks to the advanced intelligence from Station Hypo, Midway's aircraft were already in the air. Marine fighters were orbiting to intercept the incoming strike. Bombers were being armed and fueled to attack the Japanese carriers. When the Japanese struck the atoll around 0630, they found the airfield still operational but its aircraft gone. They bombed hangars, fuel storage, the seaplane hangar, and other installations. They shot down most of the defending Marine fighters, whose obsolete F-2A3 Buffalo aircraft were hopelessly outclassed by the Zeros. 13 of 20 Marine fighters were lost. But the runways remained usable, and the Japanese strike leader, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, radioed back that a second strike would be necessary to neutralize the island. That recommendation would trigger a chain of decisions that doomed the Japanese fleet. Meanwhile, Midway-based aircraft began attacking Nagumo's carriers. Between 0700 and 0830, waves of torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and high-altitude Army B-17 bombers struck at the Japanese formation. The attacks were uncoordinated, launched piecemeal as aircraft became available. 6 Navy TBF Avenger torpedo bombers attacked first. 5 were shot down. 4 Army B-26 Marauders carrying torpedoes went in next. 2 were shot down and the survivors scored no hits. Marine dive bombers attacked. Army B-17s bombed from high altitude. All were beaten off by the Japanese combat air patrol and the formidable anti-aircraft fire of the screening ships. The attacks did no damage to the Japanese carriers, but they forced Nagumo to maneuver defensively, constantly turning into the wind to launch fighters, then turning away from approaching aircraft. They also planted a seed of doubt in Nagumo's mind about the strength of Midway's defenses. Then came a complication that would prove fatal for the entire Japanese operation. At 0728, a Japanese scout plane from the cruiser Tone transmitted a report that American surface ships had been spotted to the northeast. The report was vague at first, mentioning only what appeared to be 10 enemy surface ships. Due to delays, the message did not reach Nagumo until approximately 0745, but it was enough to throw his careful planning into chaos. Nagumo now faced a terrible dilemma. He had already ordered his reserve aircraft, the second wave planes spotted on the carrier decks, to be rearmed with land attack bombs for a second strike on Midway. Now, with American ships reported, he had to consider whether those ships might include carriers. If they did, he needed torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs to attack them. At 0745, Nagumo made a decision. He ordered the rearming halted and the aircraft changed back to anti-shipping weapons. But the first Midway strike was now returning, low on fuel and some of them damaged. They needed to land. Immediately, Nagumo had to clear his decks to recover them. The result was chaos on the Japanese carrier decks. Armed and fueled aircraft were struck below to the hangars to make room for returning planes. Ordnance that had been brought up for the second armament change lay scattered on the deck and in the hangars. Aviation fuel lines snaked across the deck plates to refuel the recovered aircraft. Bombs and torpedoes were being moved in both directions. The ships were floating powder kegs crammed with explosives and aviation fuel, waiting for a spark. The American carrier strikes began arriving around 0920. First came Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron. These were TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, slow and obsolete aircraft that could barely make 120 miles per hour while carrying their heavy torpedoes. They had no fighter escort. The Wildcat fighters that should have protected them had become separated during the long flight to the target. Waldron knew exactly what he was leading his men into. The night before, he had distributed a mimeographed memo to his pilots. His words were simple but would echo through history. If there is only one plane left to make the final run-in, I want that man to go in and get a hit. May God be with us all. They did not turn back. The 15 Devastators of Torpedo 8 flew straight into the teeth of the Japanese combat air patrol. Zeros swarmed them. The slow, vulnerable torpedo bombers began falling one by one. Waldron's plane was among the first to go down. One after another, the aircraft were shot down or crashed into the sea. All 15 were lost. 29 of 30 men were killed. Ensign George Gay was the sole survivor of the carrier-launched attack. His aircraft was hit and crashed into the ocean. Wounded in the arm and leg, Gay hid beneath a floating seat cushion to avoid strafing Japanese fighters. From the water, he watched what came next. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise followed minutes later. They too had no fighter escort. 10 of 14 planes were shot down. The survivors scored no hits. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown attacked next, also unescorted. 10 of 12 aircraft went down. Again, no hits. The 3 squadron commanders, Waldron, Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay, and Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, were all killed. Of 41 torpedo bombers launched from the 3 American carriers that morning, only 6 returned to their ships. It was the single most devastating loss rate suffered by American naval aviation in the entire war. But their sacrifice was not in vain. The torpedo attacks had accomplished something crucial. They had drawn the Japanese combat air patrol down to sea level. The Zeros were occupied chasing low-flying torpedo planes, burning through their fuel and ammunition, scattered across miles of ocean. The sky above the Japanese fleet was empty. At approximately 10:22, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive bombers from Enterprise arrived over the Japanese fleet. McCluskey had led 33 SBD Dauntless dive bombers on a long search that had nearly ended in failure. He had initially flown to the predicted Japanese position and found empty ocean. The Japanese had turned north to evade the earlier attacks. McCluskey was running low on fuel. Some of his pilots had already turned back. Then McCluskey spotted something. A single Japanese destroyer, Arisher, was racing northeast at high speed, leaving a long white wake across the blue Pacific. The destroyer was hurrying to rejoin the main force after depth charging an American submarine. McCluskey made a snap decision. He turned his formation to follow the destroyer's wake. Admiral Nimitz would later say that McCluskey's decision decided the fate of the carrier task force and the forces at Midway. At 10:22, McCluskey looked down and saw the Japanese carriers spread below him. Their decks were crowded with aircraft being rearmed and refueled. Fuel hoses snaked across the deck plates. Bombs and torpedoes lay stacked near the elevators. The ships were completely vulnerable. Almost simultaneously, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's dive bombers from Yorktown were diving on a fourth carrier from a different direction. The attacks came within minutes of each other, striking from the northeast and southwest at nearly the same moment. The dive bombers pushed over into their 70-degree dives. The Dauntless was a magnificent aircraft for this kind of attack, steady and accurate, capable of placing a 1,000-pound bomb within feet of the aiming point. The pilots looked through their bomb sights at the broad flight decks expanding below them. Kaga took 4 or 5 direct hits. The first bomb struck near the forward elevator. The next hit the bridge area, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most of the senior officers. More bombs smashed through the flight deck into the hangar below, where fully armed and fueled aircraft were packed. The secondary explosions were catastrophic. Within moments, Kaga was transformed into an inferno. Akagi, Nagumo's flagship, took only 1 direct hit on the after edge of her amidships elevator. But that single bomb penetrated to the hangar deck below, where aircraft loaded with torpedoes and bombs were waiting for launch. The explosion triggered a chain reaction. Fires spread through the hangar. Ammunition detonated in uncontrollable secondary explosions. Nagumo had to be physically dragged from his bridge as flames consumed his flagship. He transferred to a cruiser, leaving Akagi to burn. Soryu took 3 1,000-pound bombs. They struck in rapid succession along the length of her flight deck. The ship was ablaze within minutes. Her magazines were threatened by the spreading fires. According to survivors, her captain, Ryosaku Yanagimoto, refused to leave his ship. A chief petty officer named Abe was sent to retrieve him by force. He reportedly found Yanagimoto standing motionless on the bridge, sword in hand. As Abe turned away, he heard the captain singing the Japanese national anthem. Yanagimoto went down with his command. In approximately 6 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers were fatally wounded. They would burn through the day and into the night before finally sinking or being scuttled by their own destroyers. But the battle was not over. Hiryu, the 4th carrier, had been separated from the others and escaped the dive-bombing attack. Her commander, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, was one of Japan's finest carrier officers. Aggressive and resourceful, he immediately launched a counterstrike against the American fleet. Around noon, 18 Val dive bombers found Yorktown. Despite fierce anti-aircraft fire that shot down several attackers, 3 bombs struck the American carrier. 1 penetrated to the engine spaces and extinguished several boilers. Yorktown lost power and stopped dead in the water, trailing smoke and listing badly. Remarkably, her damage control teams got her moving again within an hour. They restored power, they corrected the list. From a distance, she looked almost undamaged, which proved to be her undoing. When Hiryu's second strike of 10 Kate torpedo bombers arrived around 2:30 in the afternoon, they thought they were attacking a different, undamaged carrier. 2 torpedoes slammed into Yorktown's port side, tearing open her hull below the waterline. The list increased rapidly to 26 degrees. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered abandon ship. The surviving crew went over the side into the oil-covered water. Late that afternoon, American dive bombers found Hiryu. Enterprise had recovered both her own aircraft and the orphaned planes from Yorktown. Now they launched a final strike. Shortly before 5 o'clock in the afternoon, at least 4 bombs struck Hiryu, destroying her forward flight deck and starting uncontrollable fires. Kiryu burned through the night. Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Tomio Kaku decided to remain aboard. As dawn approached on June 5, with the fires still burning and the ship clearly doomed, they ordered the crew to abandon ship. Then they went down with their command, choosing death over the dishonor of surviving such a defeat. Kiryu sank later that morning. All 4 Japanese fleet carriers were now at the bottom of the Pacific. Yorktown herself remained afloat despite her damage. On June 6, a salvage party boarded her, hoping to tow her back to Pearl Harbor. The destroyer Hammond came alongside to provide power for the salvage effort. There was real hope that Yorktown might be saved. Then the Japanese submarine I-168 found the crippled carrier. The submarine fired 4 torpedoes. One struck Hammond, breaking the destroyer in half. She sank in 4 minutes with approximately 80 of her crew killed. 2 torpedoes hit Yorktown, flooding more compartments in her already damaged hull. Yorktown survived through the night, but she was beyond saving. On the morning of June 7th, she finally capsized and sank, her battle ensign still flying as she went down. The final toll revealed the magnitude of what had happened. American losses were approximately 307 killed, 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, and about 150 aircraft. Japanese losses were approximately 3,057 killed, for fleet carriers, 1 heavy cruiser, and nearly 250 aircraft. Every one of the 4 lost Japanese carriers had participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. The force that had seemed invincible, that had dominated the Pacific since December 1941, had been destroyed in a single afternoon. The Battle of Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War. Japan would never again mount a major offensive operation. They had lost not only the 4 carriers and their aircraft, but something even more irreplaceable. Over 700 highly trained maintenance technicians, armorers, and flight deck specialists perished with their ships. They represented years of accumulated expertise that could not be quickly rebuilt. The surviving Japanese pilots were consumed in the grinding battles around Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands over the following year. By 1944, when Japan finally rebuilt its carrier forces numerically, the new ships were manned by crews who had only a fraction of the training that the Midway veterans had possessed. The result was the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where American pilots destroyed more than 300 Japanese aircraft in a single day. Admiral Nimitz understood exactly what had made the victory possible. In his post-war assessment, he wrote that had they lacked early information of the Japanese movement and been caught with carrier task forces dispersed, the Battle of Midway would have ended far differently. The man who made this victory possible received a very different reward. Within months of Midway, the Redmen brothers in Washington orchestrated Joseph Rockefeller's removal from Station Hypo. The official reasons were bureaucratic, relating to organizational changes in Navy intelligence. The real reason was revenge. Rockefeller had proven them wrong, had gone over their heads, and had made them look foolish. They could not forgive him for being right. Rockefeller was replaced by an officer with no intelligence experience. He himself was assigned to command a floating dry dock in San Francisco. It was a professional humiliation, a deliberate exile for the man who had just delivered the most important intelligence coup of the Pacific War. When Admiral Nimitz recommended Rockefeller for the Distinguished Service Medal, Admiral King blocked it. Years later, when researchers examined Washington's files from that period, they found mysterious blank pages where the incorrect assessments from OP-20G should have been. Someone had removed the evidence of their failures. Rockefeller never returned to codebreaking. He retired as a captain in 1953. He died on July 20, 1976, in Torrance, California at the age of 76. He never received the recognition he deserved in his lifetime. The campaign for justice took years. Rear Admiral Donald Showers, the same ensign who had witnessed the water ruse being conceived at Jasper Holmes's desk, spent considerable effort lobbying for Rockefeller's recognition. He contacted congressmen, wrote letters, assembled documentation, and kept pushing against a bureaucracy that wanted to forget its mistakes. Finally, on May 30, 1986, almost exactly 44 years after the Battle of Midway, President Ronald Reagan presented the posthumous Distinguished Service Medal to Rockefeller's children at a White House ceremony. His daughter Janet Elding and his son, retired Army Colonel Joseph Rockefeller Jr., received the medal their father had been denied for so long. In 2000, Rockefeller was inducted into the National Security Agency's Cryptologic Hall of Honor. In 2012, a building at the intelligence facility at Pearl Harbor was dedicated in his name. The water shortage ruse that Jasper Holmes conceived took only minutes to plan and 2 days to confirm, but its consequences determined the fate of nations. It was not a discovery of new information. Rockefeller already knew that AF meant Midway. The ruse was designed to prove it to the doubters in Washington, to overcome bureaucratic resistance with evidence so clear that no one could dispute it. The men who broke the Japanese codes did not fire a single shot at Midway, but they made everything else possible. They told Nimitz where the enemy would be, when they would arrive, and what forces they would bring. They transformed what should have been a Japanese ambush into an American trap. The torpedo bomber crews who died in those terrible minutes over the Japanese fleet knew none of this. Waldron and his men went to their deaths not knowing that their sacrifice would bring down the Japanese combat air patrol and open the sky for the dive bombers. They knew only that their duty was to attack. These two groups of men, the codebreakers in their basement and the aviators over the ocean, were connected by an invisible thread of cause and effect. The intelligence gave the aviators their chance. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons gave the dive bombers their opening. Together, they changed the history of the 20th century. Today, the waters northeast of Midway Atoll are silent and deep. In 2019, the research vessel Petrel, operated by Vulcan Incorporated, found the wrecks of Kaga and Akagi resting on the seafloor more than 17,000 feet below the surface. The ships lie upright, their flight decks collapsed and corroded, but still recognizable after more than 3/4 of a century. They are monuments to a battle that turned the tide of history. Midway Atoll itself is now a wildlife refuge, home to millions of seabirds. The old runways are cracked and overgrown. On clear days, visitors can stand on the beach and look out at the waters where the battle was fought, where the torpedo bombers fell and the carriers burned, where young men gave their lives in a desperate gamble that succeeded beyond all hope. And it all began with a lie about a water shortage, conceived in a sweltering basement by men who never fired a weapon in combat. Jasper Holmes had an idea. Joseph Rockefeller approved it. 2 days later, they had proof that changed history. F was Midway. The trap was set.